Welcome back, everyone, to another amazing video. Surah 564 states in part, "The Jews say the hand of God is chained. May their hands be chained, and may they be cursed for what they say. No, both his hands are outstretched. He gives as he pleases." As usual, when the Quran purports to describe actual events in history, modern readers, along with classical Muslim exegetes most of the time, are left to wonder what on earth the Quran is talking about. Too frequently in these cases, scholars have looked to Mecca or Medina for historical context. Perhaps there were Jewish groups in those areas who made such claims about God's hands being chained, a claim portrayed in the Quran as a blasphemous metaphor, and a claim made nowhere in the Hebrew Bible. But Professor Sherry Lowen thinks that she has found the Jewish inspiration for this verse in a pre-Islamic liturgical poem called a Piyut by Rabbi Eliezer HaKalir. This particular poem is about the destruction primarily of the Second Temple and is named "Recall What the Enemy Did Inside," referring to the inside of the temple, of course. Now, just some background on the cumbersome title of this poem. Hebrew literature is frequently named by the first line or phrase that begins it. The most relevant part of this poem states, "The elders were horrified when he," referring to Titus, "was permitted from above to do his will," referring, of course, to the destruction of the Second Temple. And he, God, of course, was bound in chains. Both in the poem and in the Quran, this is understood as a metaphor, though, of course, the latter isn't fond of it. And this piyut isn't the only text of relevance. Professor Lowen has located a few more 5th to 6th century Jewish commentaries that contain a similar motif. In the Jewish context, it's clear what's being communicated. God is with his people even in exile, and even when the temple is destroyed, God's love is still apparent. For the rabbis, the destruction of the temple, or temples, referring of course to both the first and second temples, did not mean God's abandonment or hatred of the Jews, or the cancellation of his covenant with them. The rabbis taught that it was in restraining himself and allowing the destruction of the temple, as he does in the Piyut, that God displayed his continued bond with the Jews. Jewish commentators were aware of the boldness of these statements, but of course, such metaphors are ultimately grounded in a deep relationship between the biblical God and his people, a relationship that's not permitted by the God of the Quran. So Professor Lowen has advanced a very plausible thesis for the background of Surah 564, but a problem remains. Maybe. She asks, had a liturgical poem written in the land of Israel at the end of the 6th century at the earliest already made its way to the Jewish communities of Arabia by the beginning, middle of the 7th century? Now recall that she located similar earlier motifs as well. She cites those in her article, but time and geography questions remain if you believe in the traditional Islamic narrative. However, the Quran itself frequently points us past this narrative, both in time and in geography. Another example of this comes from a recent video on Stephen Shoemaker's findings at the Kathisma Church near Jerusalem. Again, this places us farther north and a good deal later than the traditional Islamic narrative allows. The case of the Kathisma Church and the Quranic nativity in Surah 19 leaves little question that we must approach the Quranic text as a corpus of traditions that remained open even beyond Muhammad's lifetime and was continuing to absorb Jewish and Christian traditions in the decades after the believers conquered and occupied the Near East. As I was reading the article on Surah 564, I was also reading a recent collection of essays on early Islam. In one essay, where the Persian milieu of the Quran's description of paradise was explored, I read this line by Gilles Courteau about how our understanding of early Islam is being remapped, in no small part by the Quran itself. He comments, "For once in Islamic studies, the compass shows north, without doubt." So while for some, time and geography might present a problem for Lowen's thesis, it doesn't for me, or most likely for anyone else who actually reads what the Quran says versus what the standard Islamic narrative says it says. As we've seen many times, those are often two very different things. So against the Islamic narrative, Surah 564 directs our compass north. It might require us to shift our timeline as well. So be it. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time.